That phone call lasted less than 1 minute. I had worked brutal night shifts to afford a train ticket and a decent gift for my sister's Ivy League graduation. Instead, my mother delivered a clear order: "Do not come, you will embarrass us." I did not argue. I just vanished. 6 years later, Princeton invited me back to stand center stage with a microphone, while my sister, who once feared my presence, wore a staff lanyard backstage. I am Reagan Greenwood, and I am 27 years old. My bones felt like they were forged from lead. I had just finished an 11-hour night shift at North Ledger Restructuring, a bankruptcy and corporate restructuring firm famous across the city for chewing up its employees and spitting out the remnants. My eyes still burned fiercely from staring at endless, glowing columns of failing corporate debt under harsh fluorescent lights. However, as I stood in the exact center of my cramped, poorly ventilated rented kitchen, the severe physical exhaustion was entirely secondary. In my raw, paper-cut hands, I held two very specific items. One was a small rectangular box, meticulously wrapped in a heavy, dark blue paper. The other was a printed train ticket destined for Princeton, New Jersey. The physical weight of those two items was negligible, but the financial gravity they held over my life was immense. That single train ticket had cost me the exact equivalent of 2 full weeks of grocery money. I had spent the last month eating nothing but cheap instant noodles and boiled rice, actively skipping my lunch breaks just to secure that one piece of paper. The dark blue box contained a heavy, premium leather portfolio. The initials PG were deeply and elegantly embossed into the genuine leather cover. Piper Greenwood, my younger sister. I had scraped together every single spare cent, hoarding coins and taking on mind-numbing data entry tasks on the weekends, just to afford a gift that felt worthy of an Ivy League graduate. I set the items down on the peeling laminate counter and picked up my phone to dial my mother. I just wanted to confirm what time I should arrive on Friday evening before the massive graduation ceremony. I wanted to know where we were having dinner, where I should meet them, how I could be useful. The phone rang exactly twice before the line connected. My mother did not say hello. She did not ask how my brutal night shift had been. She did not ask if I had slept. "Reagan," my mother said. Her voice carried that specific, icy, measured tone she always reserved for managing difficult contractors or dismissing aggressive salespeople. "I am glad you called. I need you to listen to me carefully. You need to cancel your train ticket. You are not coming this weekend." I froze completely. The low, rattling hum of my old refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening in the tiny apartment. I gripped the sharp edge of the cheap counter so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. I tried to process the auditory information, but my brain refused to translate it into reality. "What do you mean I am not coming?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I have the ticket right in front of me. I took the entire weekend off from the firm. Piper is going to be surrounded by very important people," my mother continued, her words clipping through the receiver like heavy garden shears severing a dead branch. "These are the children of major financial players. They are the parents of high-level donors. These are legacy families who live and die by their generations of established reputation. People who maintain a certain impeccable standard." I tried to find my voice, tried to insert logic into a conversation that was rapidly becoming a nightmare. "It is her graduation. I am her sister. I am family. You do not fit in with that group," she pressed on, emphasizing every single syllable with terrifying precision. It sounded as if she were editing a family portrait and had decided I did not belong in it. "You will throw off the entire image we're trying to project. You showing up in some discount rack dress, wearing those scuffed old shoes, and talking about your night classes at a state college will ruin everything. You will make the whole family look incredibly cheap. You will make us look terribly ordinary." I stood there, breathing in the smell of stale coffee and damp drywall, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unfiltered honesty of her cruelty. She was not angry. She was not having a hysterical outburst. She was simply stating a calculated business decision. Piper has worked far too hard to build her elite network to have you standing in the background looking like the hired catering staff, my mother said, delivering the final, fatal blow. Do not come. Do not stand near us. You will embarrass us. You are staying in the city. She did not wait for my response. She did not offer a secondary apology. The line went instantly dead. There was no argument to be had, just a definitive. Hollow click followed by absolute silence. Before I could even lower the useless phone from my ear, the screen lit up with a harsh bright light, signaling a new text message. It was from my father. He had not bothered to call me. He did not have the courage to hear my voice break. His message consisted of exactly 2 sentences. Piper needs this day to be perfectly flawless. You need to act mature. I stood perfectly still in that suffocating kitchen for a very long time. I looked down at the dark blue wrapped box. To buy that portfolio, I had denied myself basic human comforts. I had walked home in the freezing rain to save the bus fare. Now, my own father was commanding me to act mature, while my mother effectively and permanently erased my existence from the family narrative. I did not cry. That was the strangest part of that morning. The tears simply refused to materialize. A deep, hollow, freezing numbness settled directly into the center of my chest, turning my heart into a stone. The sharpest, most agonizing pain did not come from being uninvited to a lavish weekend party. The true agony, the kind that alters your DNA, was the undeniable realization that to my own parents, I had never truly been a daughter. I was merely a structural flaw. I was a dirty blemish that needed to be aggressively hidden away from the frame, so their picturesque illusion of upper-class perfection remained untainted. When the sun finally rose, casting a gray, indifferent light through my single, smudged apartment window, I finally moved. I made a definitive decision. I did not throw the dark blue box into the trash can, even though every instinct in my tired body screamed at me to destroy it. Instead, I took a quick shower, put my coat back on, and walked down the street to the local shipping office. I paid an outrageous premium fee for express overnight courier service straight to Piper's campus address. Inside the heavily padded package, alongside the expensive leather portfolio, I slipped in a small, crisp white card. I wrote exactly 1 sentence on that card. I am so incredibly proud of you. Wishing you a beautiful and perfect day. It was impeccably polite. It was suffocatingly kind. It was so completely devoid of any righteous anger or bitterness that it made the absolute cruelty of my family look exactly like what it was. By offering them nothing but grace, I highlighted their absolute lack of it. As I dropped the thick envelope into the dark metal belly of the mail drop, feeling the heavy, satisfying clunk of it hitting the bottom, I turned away and began the long walk back toward the subway station. I had another brutal night shift to prepare for. I needed to sleep. I did not know it then. Standing on that cold, unforgiving pavement with an empty bank account and an entirely severed bloodline. But that exact gift would not disappear into the void. That despised object, the one they deemed completely unworthy of being delivered in person by a sister who looked like a waitress, would reemerge many years later. It would return to the light not as a forgotten token of a broken past, but as the absolute, living, undeniable proof of the shallow, hollow fraud my family had built their entire miserable lives upon. The Greenwood family resided in one of those affluent New Jersey suburbs where the precise shade of your front lawn and the velvet-roped guest list of your dinner parties held vastly more weight than any actual human kindness. In our neighborhood, a person was not measured by their character or their capacity for empathy. They were measured by the ivy-draped brick facades of the universities their children attended and the exclusivity of the country clubs they frequented. It was a perfectly manicured ecosystem of relentless comparison. The air always smelled faintly of expensive fertilizer and quiet, desperate anxiety, from the very beginning of her life. My sister Piper was never just a child to our parents. She was an aggressive prestige project. She was the golden investment portfolio they intended to cash in for social currency. Every single aspect of her existence was meticulously curated. There were private test preparation tutors who charged hundreds of dollars an hour. There were elite college admissions counselors hired when she was only in the 8th grade. There were carefully documented summer volunteer trips to Europe, designed specifically to look compassionate on a university application while ensuring she never actually had to get her hands dirty. Every hobby, every extracurricular activity, every forced smile was engineered to craft a flawless applicant for the Ivy League. I was the exact opposite. I was the anomaly in their perfect ledger. I was bright, but I was stubbornly quiet, lacking the performative charisma my parents demanded. Recognizing early on that I was not the chosen investment, I started working retail and food service jobs the minute I turned 16 years old. I learned the value of $1 by standing on my feet for 8 hours a day behind a cash register. I remember the textbook incident vividly. I was in my final year of high school, trying to get a head start on my future. I needed a specific, heavy volume for an advanced accounting and financial structuring course. The book cost $245. I had just paid my own car insurance and my bank account was completely drained. I approached my father in his pristine home office, feeling a hot flush of shame, and asked if he could spot me the money. He did not even look up from his mahogany desk. "Figuring it out yourself will make you stronger," my father said, his voice flat and devoid of any parental warmth. Consider it a lesson in cash flow management. I swallowed the thick knot in my throat, nodded once, and walked out. I picked up 3 extra weekend shifts at a local diner, serving greasy eggs and pouring endless cups of cheap coffee until my feet went entirely numb, just to buy that single book. Exactly 5 days after my father denied my request, I watched my mother pack an expensive leather duffel bag for Piper. My parents had booked her a comprehensive 3-day luxury spa weekend at a high-end wellness retreat. When I asked why, my father casually explained it to my mother in the hallway. "We need to reduce Piper's stress levels," he said. "The pressure of applying to the Ivy League is immense. We must protect her mental state before the final admission interviews." My $200 educational necessity was a lesson in hardship. Her $3,000 massage weekend was a necessary emotional investment. The math was brutally simple. Then came the day the heavy, embossed envelope arrived from Princeton University. When Piper ripped it open and screamed, the house transformed into a festival of absolute validation. My parents did not just celebrate, they launched a marketing campaign. They hosted a massive garden party that very weekend. They hired professional event planners. There were towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas, a string quartet playing softly on the patio, and custom step and repeat photo backdrops. They invited every wealthy neighbor, every influential business partner, every person they ever wanted to impress. They paraded Piper around the manicured lawn as if she had just been knighted by the Queen. Social media was flooded with highly edited pictures, accompanied by long, self-congratulatory captions about how their tireless dedication and perfect parenting had finally paid off. Exactly 1 year later, a much thinner, less impressive envelope arrived for me. I had applied to a respected state university known for its rigorous accounting and data analytics program. I had not aimed for prestige. I had aimed for survival and practical skill. The letter offered me a 50% tuition scholarship based purely on my academic merit. I brought the letter into the dining room where my parents were drinking their morning coffee. I set it on the table. There were no screams of joy. There was no sudden rush to call the caterers. The silence in the room was so heavy it felt like physical pressure. My father picked up the letter. He read the entire document in exactly 3 seconds. He did not smile. He did not offer a word of praise for the scholarship I had earned entirely on my own. He placed the paper face down on the polished wood. "Do not expect us to pay the rest," he said. That was the entirety of the celebration. There was no party. There were no photographs taken to commemorate the moment. There was absolutely no hug from my mother, no proud hand on my shoulder from my father. I took my letter back, went straight to my bedroom, and opened my incredibly slow, secondhand laptop. That night, I sat alone in the dark and taught myself how to navigate the complex, humiliating labyrinth of federal student loan applications. I researched interest rates. I calculated amortization schedules. I scoured job boards for overnight shifts that would not conflict with a full-time daytime class schedule. I learned, with absolute and chilling clarity, how to survive in a world where I was not allowed to expect a single beautiful thing from the people who brought me into it. Slowly, methodically, an invisible but absolutely rigid caste system solidified within the walls of our beautiful suburban house. It was a structure built on the currency of appearance. Piper was the blue-chip stock, the premium asset that had to be protected, nurtured, and funded at all costs. She was the vessel carrying their social ambitions. I was merely the baseline requirement, the child who was just fine. I was the completely expendable asset. I was the background character who could be casually shifted to the very edge of the frame, or cropped out entirely. Whenever the lighting did not flatter the main subjects, I learned to move through that house like a ghost. I learned to mask my exhaustion when I came home at 3 a.m. from a shift, only to wake up 4 hours later for a morning lecture. I learned to stop sharing my small victories, because my perfect scores in corporate auditing were nothing compared to Piper attending a charity gala with a senator's son. Understanding this deep, structural rot was the key to understanding my family. It was the exact reason why the phone call I received in my cramped apartment kitchen years later was not shocking. When my mother ordered me to cancel my train ticket and forbade me from attending Princeton's graduation, it was not a sudden, irrational burst of anger. It was not a temporary lapse in judgment. It was the flawless, inevitable, and entirely logical conclusion of decades of conditioning. My parents had spent their entire adult lives viewing human value exclusively as a tool to polish their own social status. Since I did not possess the specific, shiny brand of value they required, I was simply discarded. I was a bad investment being written off the books. The true tragedy was not that they cut me out of a weekend celebration. The true tragedy was that they had been slowly cutting me out of their hearts since I was a child, and I had been too busy trying to earn my own keep to notice the blades moving. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a thick, suffocating humidity that clung stubbornly to the single, rattling window of my tiny studio apartment. I stood at my cramped kitchenette, pouring boiling water over a cheap paper filter filled with the most inexpensive ground coffee the corner bodega sold. The smell was bitter and burnt, a stark contrast to the catered espresso bars I knew were currently being set up across the manicured lawns of the university. I carried the chipped ceramic mug over to my small, uneven desk and flipped open my laptop. The plastic hinge gave a sharp, protesting crack, and within exactly 3 seconds of booting up, the internal cooling fan began to roar. It sounded exactly like a dying lawnmower, vibrating violently against the cheap wood of the desk. I typed in the web address for the official university live stream. The screen flickered, buffering for several long, agonizing seconds before the high-definition feed from the main campus screen flooded my scratched monitor. I did not subject myself to this broadcast out of some lingering, pathetic hope that my family would suddenly realize their mistake and miss me. I had abandoned those childish, bleeding heart fantasies long ago. I watched because, beneath the heavy layers of sheer physical exhaustion and relentless rejection, a very small, stubborn fragment of my heart still felt tied to the girl I had grown up with. I simply wanted to witness my younger sister physically cross the threshold into adulthood. I wanted to see her wear the robe. The camera panned across the vast, meticulously arranged seating area. It swept over seas of perfectly aligned folding chairs and incredibly proud relatives. Then, the lens paused, zooming in slightly on the premium, reserved section near the front of the stage. There they were. My mother was wearing an impeccably tailored, pearl-colored suit that likely cost more than 2 months of my rent. My father sat beside her in a sharp, dark navy blazer, looking incredibly distinguished. They looked exactly like the quintessential, self-sacrificing, highly successful American parents. They radiated a polished, untouchable glow, smiling warmly at the wealthy parents sitting directly next to them, projecting the absolute illusion of a family that had dedicated every single ounce of their being to their beloved child's success. I pressed the shortcut keys to capture a screenshot of the video feed. I opened the messaging application on my phone, navigated to the family group chat that had been entirely dormant for over 5 weeks, and attached the image. I typed out a careful, measured message. "Congratulations, Piper. I hope you have a truly beautiful day. I love you." I pressed send. The tiny notification confirmed it was delivered to all 3 devices. Then, I closed the laptop. I scrubbed the moldy grout in my bathroom until my knuckles bled. I reorganized my minimal, threadbare closet. I was desperate to keep my hands moving, terrified of what would happen if I sat still. Late in the afternoon, when the sun began to cast long, orange streaks across my faded rug, I finally checked my phone. There was absolutely no response in the group chat, not a single word of acknowledgement, not a simple thank you, not even an automated thumbs-up reaction. However, when I opened my social media feed, the very first post at the absolute top of my timeline was a massive photo album uploaded by Piper. The images were stunningly vibrant. They featured professional angles and perfect, golden hour lighting. There was my sister in her cap and gown, clutching her expensive diploma, sandwiched tightly between my beaming parents. The caption beneath the highly curated album struck me with the devastating force of a physical blow. It read exactly like this: "Just the 3 of us, always together." Reading those 8 words hurt substantially more than the actual phone call banning me from the campus had. The ban was a logistical maneuver to hide me for one single weekend. That caption was a permanent, public erasure. It did not merely crop me out of a specific photograph. It fundamentally rewrote our entire family history for the whole world to consume. It boldly declared to their extensive network of friends, colleagues, and influential acquaintances that I simply did not exist. I was not a disappointment. I was not an estranged daughter struggling to make ends meet. I was nothing at all. I was a blank space. As the evening settled in, bringing a cold draft through the gaps in my window frame, my phone vibrated loudly against the hard surface of my desk. It was a direct message. It was a private text from my mother. I opened it, my thumb hovering nervously over the cracked glass screen. "Do not leave any comments under Piper's photos," her message read. The tone was completely devoid of any maternal emotion, entirely transactional and cold. "Do not attempt to tag us in any of your own posts. Do not do anything that might distract from her or shift the attention away from her achievements on her special day." That was the exact moment the final, severely frayed nerve connecting me to my bloodline snapped completely in half. There was no dramatic explosion of grief. There were no hot tears blurring my vision. There was no screaming at the walls. There was only a sudden, profound, and terrifyingly cold clarity that washed over my entire body. I was a ghost trying desperately to haunt a house that had already been demolished and paved over. I did not reply to her message. Instead, I navigated directly to my phone settings. I selected my mother's contact profile, scrolled to the very bottom, and pressed block. I did the exact same thing for my father. I found Piper's number and blocked her as well. I opened every single social media application on my device, went deep into the account settings, and permanently deleted my profiles. I did not deactivate them to take a temporary break. I wiped my entire digital footprint from their curated world. I vanished from their screens just as they had vanished me from their lives. Next, I opened my web browser and logged into my highly secure employee portal for North Ledger restructuring. I navigated to the Human Resources tab and opened my emergency contact information file. I highlighted my father's name and his premium cell phone number, and I deleted it. I replaced it with the name of a senior night shift coworker who occasionally shared a cab ride home with me after a particularly brutal audit. If I collapsed from pure exhaustion, or if a cab crashed on the icy winter roads at 4 a.m, the city hospital would call a virtual stranger before they ever reached my parents. I stopped completely. I stopped trying to prove that I was worthy of taking up space in their pristine lives. I stopped waiting for a loving invitation that was clearly never going to be mailed. I ceased draining my own vitality merely to sustain their meticulously fabricated, deceptive facade. I withdrew into a lasting obscurity. This was no deafening, turbulent uprising meant to capture the spotlight. I did not plan an immediate, fiery revenge to ruin their night. I simply and methodically withdrew every single ounce of my emotional investment from the three people I used to call my family. They wanted a flawless, unblemished trio. They wanted a perfectly clean narrative without any messy, struggling relatives to drag down their social standing, huddled in the shadows of my tiny flat, hearing the far-off wail of urban alarms. I surrendered precisely what they demanded by severing all contact and vanishing entirely off the grid. The absolute silence that followed my disappearance was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, and I filled it entirely with an exhausting, relentless grind. With the rotting emotional anchor of my family completely severed, my life stripped down to two singular, uncompromising pillars: my university classes during the daylight hours, and the brutal night shifts at North Ledger Restructuring. I became a machine powered by cheap caffeine and a deeply ingrained, freezing anger. The firm was a notorious graveyard for failing corporations, a place where dying companies came to have their bones picked clean or their debts aggressively restructured. The environment was a high-stakes battlefield of paperwork, and the lowest trench on that battlefield was the document digitization department, commonly known as the scanning room. It was late October, during a night where a massive storm battered the city. Heavy sheets of rain lashed violently against the thick, reinforced glass of our office building, rattling the window frames on the 14th floor. The atmosphere inside was equally chaotic. We had just received a massive, emergency file dump from a colossal, collapsing, national retail chain. The company was hemorrhaging cash by the hour, and every single senior partner and associate on the floor was rushing frantically to process and submit a mountain of legal paperwork to a federal judge before dawn. Their goal was to secure a temporary stay of execution, a legal maneuver to freeze the company's assets and prevent immediate liquidation before the markets opened in the morning. I was trapped in the suffocating heat of the scanning room, surrounded by towering stacks of physical invoices, expense reports, and vendor contracts. The heavy-duty commercial scanners whirred and clacked endlessly, filling the air with the smell of hot plastic and ozone. My job was simple, mindless, and mechanical: feed the paper, check the digital image quality, index the file name, and repeat. I was supposed to be completely invisible. It was around 3 a.m. when the blur of black ink and white paper suddenly stopped making sense. I was processing a thick stack of recent vendor disbursements. These were high-priority payments being pushed through the emergency authorization queue. I fed a crumpled invoice into the machine. It was for a logistics consulting firm. A few minutes later, I processed another invoice for a supply chain management group. 10 minutes after that, a third invoice for a regional distribution partner crossed my desk. I stopped. I pulled the 3 original physical papers out of the output tray and laid them side by side on my cramped desk under the harsh fluorescent light. To a tired eye, they looked perfectly normal. They featured 3 completely different company names, 3 different glossy logos, and slightly varying invoice numbers. But I did not have a tired eye. I had an eye trained by months of obsessive, self-taught financial analysis. The structural layout of the tables on all 3 invoices was completely identical. The margins matched exactly, down to the millimeter. The font used for the itemized billing codes was a highly specific, slightly outdated typeface. Most glaringly, the overlapping financial amounts were mathematically unnatural. They were billing for overlapping services on the exact same dates, and the total amounts were all calculated to fall just a few $100s below the standard secondary review threshold. I quickly cross-referenced the payment routing information. They were 3 distinct corporate entities, but the registered billing addresses all led back to the exact same virtual post office box in a neighboring state. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I realized exactly what I was looking at. This was not a clerical error. This was a highly coordinated, aggressive extraction. The senior executives of the collapsing retail chain knew the ship was sinking, and they were using these shell companies to siphon the very last of the liquid capital out of the wreckage before the bankruptcy courts locked the doors. If these specific disbursement files were digitally approved and submitted with the main package by dawn, millions of dollars would vanish into those phantom accounts. Worse, that capital was legally earmarked for the severance and compensation funds of thousands of frontline retail workers who were about to lose their jobs right before the winter holidays. The executives would walk away wealthy, and the workers would be left with absolutely nothing. I was merely a night shift scanning clerk in the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of North Ledger restructuring. My only permitted function was to turn paper into pixels. Stepping out of my room and interrupting a high-stakes executive session was a guaranteed way to get fired on the spot. I looked at the 3 fraudulent invoices. I thought about my father telling me that struggling to pay for my own textbooks would make me stronger, while he financed luxury vacations for my sister. I thought about the people at the bottom who always paid the price for the greed of those at the top. I grabbed the 3 original documents, shoved them into a plain manila folder, and walked straight out of the scanning room. I moved quickly across the chaotic main floor, dodging exhausted junior associates carrying trays of stale coffee. I headed directly toward the massive, glass-walled conference room at the center of the office. Inside, a dozen senior figures were arguing over complex spreadsheets displayed on a massive screen. At the very head of the long mahogany table stood Vera Kincaid. Vera was the director of forensic investigations. She was a legend within the industry, notoriously cold, terrifyingly sharp, and entirely devoid of patience for incompetence. She had a well-documented reputation for verbally crushing weak, unprepared employees with a single, devastating look. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The sudden intrusion caused a wave of stunned silence to crash over the room. 12 highly paid, incredibly stressed professionals turned to stare at the 27-year-old girl wearing a faded, oversized gray sweater and cheap slacks. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" a senior partner barked from the side of the table, his face flushing red with immediate anger. "We are in the middle of a critical filing. Get out." I ignored him entirely. I walked straight up to Vera Kincaid. I did not apologize for the interruption. I did not tremble. I simply opened the manila folder and placed the 3 invoices directly over the legal brief she was currently reviewing. "The executive team at the retail chain is looting the employee severance fund," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "These 3 vendors are shell entities. They share identical invoice formatting, artificial billing thresholds, and the same virtual mailing address. If you authorize the disbursement package you are holding right now, the money is gone by morning." The partner who had yelled started to stand up, ready to physically throw me out of the room. Vera raised one single, impeccably manicured hand. The partner froze instantly. Vera did not look at me. She looked down at the 3 pieces of paper. The room was so quiet, I could hear the rain violently striking the glass walls behind her. For exactly 60 seconds, her eyes darted back and forth across the documents, her brilliant mind rapidly verifying the structural anomalies I had just pointed out. Suddenly, she reached out and slammed her hand down on the digital intercom sitting on the table. "Lock the disbursement files," Vera ordered the central processing desk, her voice cracking like a whip. "Halt all outgoing financial authorizations for the retail account immediately. Flag the executive compensation queue for hard review." She finally looked up from the papers and locked her eyes directly onto mine. Her gaze was piercing, analytical, and heavily guarded. She did not thank me. She did not offer a small smile of encouragement. She simply nodded once, dismissing me back to the shadows. Within 4 hours, as the gray light of dawn finally broke over the city skyline, Vera's forensic team had completely unraveled the massive fraud ring that the senior legal team had entirely missed in their panicked rush. The siphoning was stopped. I finished my shift, my body aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I was packing my worn canvas backpack, fully expecting to receive an email from Human Resources terminating my employment for insubordination. Instead, the heavy door to the scanning room opened. It was Vera Kincaid's executive assistant. She told me Vera wanted to see me in her office immediately. Vera's office was situated in the corner of the building, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked city streets. It was stark, minimalist, and intimidating. When I walked in, she was standing by the window, holding a ceramic cup of black tea. She did not invite me to sit down. "Who are you?" Vera asked. She did not use a polite, conversational tone. It was an interrogation. "You are listed in our system as a Level 1 data entry clerk. Yet, you just walked into a room full of partners, interrupted a federal filing, and identified a sophisticated cash extraction model that my senior associates completely overlooked." I stood perfectly straight. "My name is Reagan." "Where did you learn to read a ledger like a 10-year veteran?" she demanded, turning to face me. "Who is backing you? Where did you go to school?" I did not flinch. I did not try to make my story sound tragic or inspiring. I just gave her the absolute, unvarnished truth. "I attend a state university during the day," I replied, keeping my voice entirely level. "I am teaching myself advanced data analytics and financial accounting. I pay my own tuition. I pay my own rent. I have absolutely no one backing me. I do not have a safety net. I learned to read a ledger because I need to understand exactly how money moves, because a lack of money is the only thing that has ever dictated my life." Vera stared at me. She looked at my exhausted eyes, my cheap sweater, and my defensive posture for the first time. A microscopic shift occurred in her icy expression. It was not pity. It was not maternal warmth. It was pure, calculating recognition. She recognized the sharp, jagged edges of someone who had survived by turning their anger into a weapon. She walked back to her massive glass desk and picked up a heavy, silver pen. "You are not someone who should spend her entire life inside a scanning room," Vera said. Vera Kincaid did not rescue me by offering a maternal embrace or a gentle, guiding hand. She rescued me by dragging me out of the scanning room and throwing me directly into a professional crucible that bordered on the completely inhumane. My new schedule under her direct supervision was an absolutely grueling, relentless marathon of endurance. I was immediately plunged into a punishing cycle maintaining my existing university coursework, working extended night shifts at the firm, preparing for the notoriously difficult Certified Public Accountant examinations, and undergoing her private, brutal training in forensic data analysis. My singular objective was clear. I had to learn how to construct chains of financial evidence so dense, so meticulously sourced, and so structurally sound that not a single high-priced corporate lawyer could ever hope to break them. My physical existence was rapidly reduced to bare biological necessities. I slept a maximum of 4 to 5 hours a day, usually in fragmented bursts on the hard mattress of my cramped studio apartment. I survived on cheap protein bars, black coffee, and lukewarm tap water during the day. I attended my university lectures, absorbing the theoretical frameworks of macroeconomics and corporate taxation. By night, I was back at North Ledger restructuring, no longer just feeding paper into a digital scanner, but actively dissecting the rotting financial organs of failing corporations. During my brief, 30-minute meal breaks, I did not rest. I sat in the harsh fluorescent glow of the firm's break room, scrolling through hundreds of pages of declassified federal fraud reports, desperately training my eyes to spot the invisible mechanisms of ghost cash flows and phantom vendors. My daily commute on the city subway became my dedicated study hall. The swaying, noisy subway car was my library, as I memorized complex tax codes and stringent auditing regulations. Vera was an absolute dictator of precision. She possessed zero tolerance for intellectual laziness. Every single time I miscalculated a complex depreciation formula, or every time I failed to identify a deeply buried link between a parent company and an obscure offshore subsidiary, she did not gently correct my work. She deleted the entire digital file and forced me to start completely over from the very beginning. She was particularly ruthless regarding my written analysis. If I submitted a draft report using weak, passive language, she would tear it apart. "Look at this sentence. Reagan," Vera said one evening, dropping my printed report onto my desk. "You wrote that this discrepancy might suggest an irregularity. We do not deal in suggestions. We deal in mathematics. If the money is gone, it demonstrates a deliberate diversion of funds. Fix your vocabulary. Do it again." She demanded that I become bulletproof. "You do not have the luxury of hesitation." Vera told me during another late-night review session, "When you walk into a corporate boardroom, they will look at your age, your background, and the name of your state university, and they will immediately try to discount you. They will look for any excuse to dismiss your findings. You have to be so undeniably, devastatingly accurate that nobody in this entire industry can ever attribute your success to blind luck. You must become a weapon of absolute fact." That suffocating harshness suited me perfectly. It synchronized flawlessly with the solid block of ice that had permanently replaced my heart. I no longer possessed the energetic capacity to weep over my family or mourn the loss of their affection. The agonizing grief of being erased from my sister's graduation and my parents' lives had not simply vanished. It had undergone a massive, internal state change. It had sublimated directly from crushing sorrow into an unbreakable, terrifying discipline. Every single ounce of my strength, every ounce of the anger I felt from being treated like a dirty secret, was completely converted into analytical stamina. The results of this punishing regimen eventually manifested in undeniable metrics. I sat for my professional licensing examinations and passed every single section on the first attempt with scores resting directly in the 99th percentile. The day the final results were officially published, Vera did not throw a party. She did not even buy me a cup of coffee. She simply sent a 2-line email to the Human Resources Department. By the end of that business day, my security access badge was upgraded. I was officially transitioned out of the support staff division and given a permanent desk on the main floor as a fully credentialed forensic analyst at North Ledger. My education immediately shifted from the theoretical to the intensely practical. I began accompanying the senior investigative teams out into the field. Walking into a company under active investigation was exactly like walking into a crime scene before the bodies were completely cold. I stopped looking at companies as abstract entities and started reading their true, unfiltered narratives through their physical ledgers. I learned to read the actual health of a corporation through the chaotic disarray of their vendor invoices. I learned to detect the exact moment a chief executive officer started panicking by analyzing the sudden, erratic shifts in their standard payment schedules. Most importantly, I learned to identify the unmistakable stench of human greed hidden within deeply categorized line items. The executives would initially look at me, a young woman in a sharp but inexpensive suit, and their reaction was always a condescending relief. They thought I was a junior secretary sent to take notes. They stopped smiling exactly 10 minutes into the interview, when I would place a highlighted expense report on the mahogany table and ask them to explain why a regional manager required a $70,000 chartered flight to inspect a warehouse that had been closed for 3 years. I learned how to track the money that funded secret lives, using corporate client entertainment budgets to uncover unimaginable entitlement. While I was methodically building my entire existence on a foundation of undeniable, hard skills, fragments of news about my family occasionally trickled down to me. These updates came through distant, gossiping relatives who still had my old email address and felt the need to share the family triumphs. The dispatches from their world indicated that Piper was living a life glossier and more aggressively curated than ever before. She was constantly seen at exclusive contemporary art galleries, attending soft openings for ultra-luxury boutique hotels, and securing invitations to private charity events strictly reserved for the right kind of people. An aunt forwarded me an online magazine article featuring Piper. It named her one of the top 30 under 30 brand consultants in the tri-state area. The photograph showed her holding a crystal glass of champagne, leaning casually against a rented sports car, wearing a designer dress that cost more than my entire first year of university tuition. The article heavily praised her innovative vision and her elite networking skills. To an untrained observer, it looked like monumental, effortless success. I read these updates without a single tremor of emotion. I did not feel a burning wave of jealousy, nor did I feel the familiar, hollow ache of rejection. To a forensic accountant, Piper's life looked exactly like a Ponzi scheme. There was no mention of actual profit margins in that article, no discussion of tangible business deliverables, and absolutely no indication of generated revenue. It was pure, unadulterated marketing fluff designed to attract more investors to keep the illusion afloat. In her case, those investors were my parents. The deeper I delved into the world of corporate restructuring and financial collapse, the more clearly I understood the fundamental mechanics of my sister's reality. I was spending my days dismantling companies that had tried to substitute aggressive marketing for actual, liquid capital. Looking at Piper's heavily filtered life, I realized she was executing the exact same fraudulent business model. She was aggressively building her entire identity on a theatrical stage equipped with an incredibly thin, fragile floor. She was operating entirely on borrowed social capital. By the time my brutal apprenticeship under Vera reached its conclusion, my transformation was absolute. I was completely unrecognizable from the exhausted, desperate 27-year-old girl who had stood weeping in a cramped kitchen, heartbroken over being banned from stepping foot on the prestigious grounds of Princeton University. That girl was dead and buried beneath mountains of audited spreadsheets. I had evolved into a completely different creature. I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was an apex predator in an ecosystem of paper and numbers. I possessed the rare, highly specialized ability to pick up a dense, 1,000-page corporate financial dossier, flip through the categorized exhibits, and within a matter of minutes, smell the distinct, undeniable odor of a catastrophic disaster preparing to detonate. I did not need to beg for a seat at anyone's table ever again, because I now possessed the exact skills required to dismantle their table completely. Following her highly publicized graduation, my sister did not endure the indignity of submitting resumes or sitting through entry-level interviews. Instead, she immediately launched a luxury brand consulting studio. Her target demographic was extremely specific. She catered to high society weddings, elite charity fundraisers, and wealthy families desperate to purchase a veneer of established class. She sold them personal image curation. To Piper, a successful event was not about the joy of the participants. It was about ensuring the napkin rings perfectly matched the imported floral centerpieces for a society magazine spread. My parents instantly adopted her new business as their second major prestige project. They treated it like a high-stakes corporate launch rather than a vanity hobby. And the financial hemorrhage began immediately. They paid the lease for a pristine, glass-walled office space in a premium downtown district that cost nearly $8,000 a month. They signed the paperwork for a brand-new European luxury sport utility vehicle because Piper insisted she could not arrive at client meetings in a standard car. They funded a massive wardrobe overhaul, a digitally engineered website, and endless rounds of extravagant networking dinners. When Piper asked for $25,000 to join an exclusive, invite-only social club, she did not call it begging. She called it a necessary strategic investment. My parents simply wrote the check without a single complaint. While my sister was busy playing the role of a successful chief executive officer, I was operating in a completely different reality. As I took on more complex corporate investigations at North Ledger, a chilling, repetitive formula began to emerge from the wreckage of every collapsed company I audited. I realized that individuals who were violently obsessed with maintaining an aura of prestige were almost always willing to steal the futures of other people to pay for it. I became intimately acquainted with a sickening pattern. I saw corporate scholarship funds systematically gutted to organize self-congratulatory galas. I traced money originally earmarked for low-income student support as it was quietly reclassified into the marketing and public relations budget. Whenever a prestigious institution needed to balance its books to afford a new architectural vanity project, the poorest, Most vulnerable people on the ledger were always the very first names to be erased. The ultimate turning point in my career arrived when our firm was brought in to quietly review the Summit Scholars Trust within the elite circles of higher education. Summit was an absolute titan. It was a massive philanthropic fund with a $50 million endowment, designed specifically to provide full-ride scholarships and living stipends to brilliant students from impoverished backgrounds. However, confidential whistleblowers suspected the fund was quietly bleeding out. They alleged that capital was being rerouted through a complex network of backdoor vendor companies to finance absurdly lavish events and flashy, overpriced consulting contracts. Vera Kincaid bypassed 3 senior associates and placed me directly onto the core investigative team. She chose me because I read data cleanly and I completely refused to be intimidated by the heavy, influential names sitting on the board of directors. More importantly, she knew I harbored a deep, radioactive hatred for the specific brand of hypocrisy that used the noble concept of education as a decorative shield for unchecked greed. "I want you to rip their books apart," Vera told me during our initial strategy meeting, sliding a massive encrypted hard drive across her desk. "Do not show them an ounce of respect. Follow every single cent." I dove into the financial archives of the trust, and the deeper I dug, the more grotesque the financial architecture became. I spent weeks tracking authorized disbursements in the quiet hum of the firm. I sat staring at 2 distinct columns on my monitor. On the left side were the formal rejection letters sent to desperate, highly qualified students. The letters claimed the trust was experiencing unprecedented financial constraints and could not offer aid. On the right side were the approved invoices for the annual spring gala. I watched grants that were supposed to provide $5,000 for a struggling student's meal plan get funneled out to a boutique floral company to provide orchids for a single charity dinner. They spent $85,000 on a custom lighting rig and $40,000 on imported caviar, all paid for through dummy corporations set up by the board members themselves. The money meant for working-class kids who were studying under flickering streetlights was being swallowed whole to keep the elite class comfortable and well-fed. While I was mapping the exact coordinates of this massive fraud, my own family was quietly suffocating under the weight of their fabricated reality. My network of estranged relatives provided a steady trickle of devastating gossip. Piper's consulting studio was fundamentally hollow. She possessed a spectacular vocabulary of meaningless corporate buzzwords, but she had absolutely no idea how to actually generate sustainable revenue. She would secure a meeting with a wealthy bride, spend $3,000 on a presentation lunch, and then lose the contract because she could not provide a basic logistical timeline to keep her business from publicly collapsing. My parents entered a state of blind panic. They began secretly pumping money into her failing enterprise. First, they drained their high-yield savings accounts. My mother would proudly tell her friends at the country club that Piper was simply in the brand-building phase, completely refusing to admit that the brand was a financial black hole. When the liquid cash evaporated, my parents began quietly liquidating their retirement portfolios, taking massive tax penalties just to get the funds in hand. Finally, when all other options were exhausted, they quietly visited a bank and took out a massive second mortgage on their immaculate suburban home. Taking out a second mortgage was the ultimate admission of failure in their social circle, so they hid it like a terminal illness. My father stopped playing his weekly round of golf because he could no longer justify the $300 greens fee, claiming to his friends that he had developed a bad shoulder. My mother stopped hosting her lavish dinner parties, citing a sudden desire for a minimalist lifestyle. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer terror that their social circle might discover their golden Ivy League daughter could not stand on her own 2 feet. The irony was sharp and inescapable. My sister and I were both intimately entangled in the exact same ecosystem of extreme wealth, high society reputation, and prestigious titles. However, our roles were entirely reversed. I was spending my days systematically tearing that world apart, exposing its rotten core with raw intellect and mathematically perfect evidence. Meanwhile, Piper was desperately trying to survive inside that same collapsing world. clinging to appearances while the structure beneath her gave way, financed by the financial ruin of the parents who had once thought she was flawless. I spent the next 6 months practically living inside a highly secure, windowless conference room at North Ledger Restructuring. I was tasked with building a massive, dynamic digital model designed to cross-reference and analyze tens of thousands of individual financial transactions executed by the Summit Scholars Trust over the past 10 years. The deeper I descended into the raw data, the more grotesque the financial architecture became. It did not resemble a philanthropic organization. It functioned exactly like a highly sophisticated, aggressively managed money laundering syndicate. I painstakingly connected the scattered, deeply buried data points. I successfully proved the existence of an elaborate, circular payment network operating entirely in the shadows. The endowment capital, money strictly designated for scholarships, flowed from the primary trust accounts directly into newly formed shell event planning companies. From there, the massive funds were funneled into elite image consulting firms. And finally, they settled quietly into the private, offshore bank accounts of family-owned legal entities that were merely hiding behind the polished veneer of legitimate charity. It was a closed loop of absolute unchecked greed. When Vera Kincaid and our core investigative team prepared to submit our final devastating findings to the federal regulators, the people whose luxurious, insulated lives we were about to dismantle launched a massive, heavily coordinated counterattack. They did not attempt to fight us on the actual mathematics, because they knew the mathematics were completely bulletproof. Instead, they fought dirty. High-powered defense lawyers began flooding our firm with aggressively worded cease and desist orders, accompanied by threats of $50 million defamation lawsuits. When Vera handed me the first stack of legal threats, she did not flinch. She simply looked me dead in the eye and said, "They are bleeding. Reagan. Burn their kingdom to the ground and leave absolutely nothing standing." When the legal threats failed to halt our momentum, they initiated a targeted smear campaign in the financial press. Anonymous sources connected to the board of directors leaked subtly vicious, highly manipulative articles designed to completely undermine my professional credibility. The hit pieces referred to me as an overly aggressive, inexperienced public school accountant who fundamentally lacked the elite social background required to properly understand the complex, sophisticated nuances of high-level institutional philanthropy. They painted me as a bitter outsider trying to tear down a noble institution out of sheer class resentment. They fully intended to intimidate me. They confidently expected me to fold, cry, and retreat under the immense, crushing pressure of hostile public scrutiny. They completely failed to understand that their psychological strategy was fundamentally flawed. I did not break. I did not retreat. And my hands did not shake for a single second. I had already heard that exact same condescending, elitist tone from my own mother many years ago. Standing in my cramped, freezing kitchen, when you have survived being systematically erased by your own bloodline for not fitting into their wealthy, aesthetic vision. A few threatening letters from panicked corporate executives feel like nothing more than a mild, passing breeze. Absolutely no one in that entire upper strata of society possessed the power to make me feel small or unworthy ever again. The ultimate, unavoidable confrontation arrived during the pivotal, high-stakes hearing before the National Education Accountability Board in Washington. The grand cavernous hearing room was packed shoulder to shoulder with hostile defense attorneys wearing $5,000 suits, nervous university executives sweating under the bright lights, and aggressive financial journalists waiting for blood. When the chairman finally called my name and it was my turn to take the floor, I did not raise my voice to match the hostility in the room. I did not engage in passionate, theatrical accusations. I simply connected my encrypted laptop to the massive central projector screen and presented the master cash flow diagram I had meticulously built. I walked the silent board members through the exact, undeniable trajectory of every single stolen dollar. I showed them exactly how a federal grant meant to cover 4 full years of tuition for a brilliant, first-generation college student was instead diverted to purchase imported crystal chandeliers and vintage champagne for a single, self-congratulatory fundraising dinner. The entire room went completely, terrifyingly silent. The profound silence did not happen because I was shouting or demanding their absolute attention. It happened because the numbers displayed on the massive screen were brutally, undeniably beautiful in their absolute clarity. I had mapped their unchecked greed with mathematical perfection, and there was absolutely no dark corner left for them to hide in. The case exploded across the national news cycle less than 48 hours later. The federal authorities moved swiftly, immediately freezing the compromised trust accounts and issuing a wave of indictments. We successfully facilitated the recovery of over $22 million in stolen endowment funds. More importantly, hundreds of vital financial aid grants for low-income students that had been previously canceled were instantly reinstated and permanently secured. Almost overnight, my name began appearing across major publications and evening broadcasts. I was suddenly being heralded by the press as the new, uncompromising face of forensic finance and corporate public ethics. I started receiving breathless interview requests from prominent national television networks and incredibly lucrative partnership offers from elite corporate law firms. However, I completely refused to become a flashy, performative celebrity. I politely but firmly declined the television appearances, and I ignored the high-profile gala invitations that flooded my inbox. The more these prestigious organizations asked me to speak, the more fiercely I guarded my personal privacy. I operated with a deep, almost paralyzing fear that absorbing too much of that toxic, public aura would somehow contaminate the hard, honest core I had paid such an agonizingly high price to build. I refused to let my trauma become entertainment. It was precisely this unique combination of undeniable professional capability, my decidedly non-elite, working-class background, and my highly publicized role in saving the Summit Scholars Trust that caught the attention of a very specific group of people. In early April, I received a thick, formally embossed envelope delivered directly to my office desk. It was from the official graduation organizing committee at Princeton University. They were not writing to invite me to sit quietly in the audience. They were formally extending an invitation for me to serve as the singular keynote speaker for that year's massive commencement ceremony. The enclosed letter, signed personally by the university president, explicitly stated their reasoning. They wrote that the committee desperately wanted a speaker who could articulate the true nature of authentic, hard-won success. They stated that I perfectly represented self-made ability, rigorous discipline, and unyielding integrity in an era that had become tragically and dangerously mesmerized by shallow appearances and unearned privilege. I sat alone at my desk and stared at the heavy, cream-colored paper with the prestigious university crest for a very long time. I thought about the cheap train ticket I had purchased exactly 6 years prior. I thought about the dark blue leather portfolio I had mailed away in tears. I quietly opened my laptop, drafted a brief, formally worded email to the graduation committee, and officially accepted their invitation. I did not pick up the phone to call my mother. I did not send a quick text message to my father. I absolutely did not attempt to contact Piper. I kept the monumental news entirely to myself, guarding it like a secret I could not afford to share. I understood the twisted psychological mechanics of my family far too well to make that catastrophic mistake. If I had given them even the slightest advance notice, they would not have called to offer their genuine congratulations or apologize for their past cruelty. They would have immediately panicked, spun an elaborate new web of lies to their social circle, and frantically tried to find a way to insert their own names into my hard-earned victory. They would have proudly claimed to everyone listening that my success was the direct result of their tough love and excellent, visionary parenting. I was not going to give them the opportunity to steal my narrative ever again. They had spent my entire life carefully cropping me out of their perfect, curated picture. Now, I was going to step onto the largest, most prestigious stage in their entire universe, and I was going to do it completely alone. The ultimate form of retribution is never a screaming match. It is a silent, undeniable checkmate. The board was already set. The final pieces were moving into place, and my family had no idea the game they started years ago was almost over. The pristine facade of Piper's luxury brand consulting studio shattered exactly the way all fragile, empty things do when they finally collide with a hard surface. It turned out that wealthy, demanding brides and high society event chairs actually expected rigorous logistical competence, not just a curated mood board of imported Italian linens and vague concepts of elegance. When her real clients quickly realized that she could only speak in hollow marketing buzzwords but had absolutely no idea how to negotiate hard vendor contracts, manage a caterer's intricate timeline, or secure proper city permits, the disastrous reviews began to circulate rapidly through the Whisper network. Once my parents could no longer afford to aggressively pump thousands of dollars into her performative networking dinners and her exclusive country club memberships, her supposedly elite inner circle vanished overnight. Loyalty in that specific tax bracket was always just a short-term rental agreement, and her lease had officially expired. The financial rot swiftly and mercilessly infected the immaculate suburban house. My father, a man who had spent his entire adult life loudly proclaiming that financial struggle was simply a moral failing of the lazy lower classes, was forced to swallow his massive pride. He had to quietly liquidate the very last profitable shares of his retirement portfolio, eating massive early withdrawal penalties just to keep the property taxes paid and the lights turned on. My mother, completely desperate to maintain the public illusion of their liquid wealth, took a part-time retail position at a high-end, imported furniture showroom located in the downtown district. She spent her days aggressively spinning this humiliating reality to her wealthy neighbors. She would wave her manicured hands and laugh sharply, describing the grueling retail hours and the demanding customers as a delightful, quirky midlife hobby designed simply to keep her creative juices flowing. It was a pathetic, entirely transparent performance that fooled absolutely no one. The final devastating blow landed when the bank rejected their application to refinance the mortgage. The cash flow completely choked. Platinum credit cards were suddenly and humiliatingly declined at local grocery stores, having been stretched to their absolute maximum limits. The atmosphere inside the pristine Greenwood residence mutated rapidly from glossy arrogance to a suffocating, deeply toxic resentment. The large house was constantly filled with the sounds of slammed mahogany doors and bitter, sharp arguments echoing down the carpeted hallways. They were drowning in a sea of unpaid invoices, and instead of swimming together, they were just desperately trying to pull each other under the water. Every minor inconvenience sparked a vicious shouting match about who was truly responsible for their sudden plunge into the middle class. For the very first time in her pampered, highly curated life, Piper lost the absolute privilege of turning her nose up at work she deemed beneath her social station. The luxury car was quietly repossessed in the middle of the night. The glass-walled downtown office was cleared out, and she was forced into the real labor market. Pure financial desperation drove her to accept a seasonal, hourly supervisor position at Elmbridge Event Services. Elmbridge was the primary third-party logistics vendor contracted to handle the heavy, entirely unglamorous backstage operations for major campus events around the Princeton University area. Her new reality was entirely devoid of prestige or glamour. She was no longer the brilliant, visionary creative director holding a crystal glass of champagne for a magazine feature. Instead, she was required to wear a stiff, unflattering black polo shirt equipped with a bulky, crackling two-way radio clipped to her belt. Her daily responsibilities consisted of aggressively guarding laminated seating charts, processing hundreds of plastic access badges for impatient guests, and physically dragging heavy cardboard boxes filled with misspelled name tags across hot, unforgiving asphalt. She spent her long, grueling days conducting tedious inventory on cheap corporate gifts and appeasing incredibly rude, entitled attendees who looked right through her, treating her exactly like an invisible, indentured servant. She was constantly sprinting through the dark, chaotic backstage corridors, her feet covered in painful blisters. She had literally become exactly what my mother had always feared: the exhausted, hired help standing silently at the very edge of the frame, entirely excluded from the main event. Of course, my mother absolutely refused to accept this devastating socioeconomic downgrade. She immediately deployed her signature psychological distortion field. She stood on her perfectly manicured front lawn and proudly boasted to anyone who would listen. Piper was just aggressively recruited to coordinate high-level executive operations for the most elite events at Princeton. They simply could not run the season without her unique expertise. She deliberately weaponized the university's prestigious name, wrapping it tightly around Piper's minimum wage. Logistical nightmare of a job like an expensive silk scarf trying to cover a gaping, bleeding wound. In my mother's severely fractured mind, as long as Piper was physically breathing the exact same air as the academic and financial elite, the family had not truly fallen out of the upper-class stratosphere they worshipped so fiercely. The standard operational policy at Elmbridge Event Services included a minor, routine corporate perk. Key logistical staff members were allocated a small handful of complimentary guest passes for their immediate families to attend the massive end-of-season commencement ceremony. It was a cheap, easy way for the company to compensate their frontline employees for working brutal 70-hour weeks during the final graduation rush without actually paying them a proper overtime bonus. My parents seized those complimentary guest passes with the frantic, starving desperation of entirely drowning people grabbing at a heavily deflated life raft. They saw the upcoming ceremony not as a grueling, humiliating work weekend for their exhausted daughter, but as a divine, golden opportunity for their own social resurrection. They immediately booked a wildly overpriced, non-refundable hotel room just outside the campus limits. They maxed out their very last available credit line, swiping a card with a terrifyingly high interest rate, just to purchase new, impeccably tailored outfits. They spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, meticulously planning their strategic photo opportunities around the iconic, ivy-covered university arches. They were absolutely determined to capture that one perfect, wealthy image, entirely convinced that the universe still owed them a flawless family portrait to post on their dormant social media accounts. They packed their expensive leather overnight bags and drove toward the campus, completely and blissfully blind to the impending catastrophe waiting for them. They firmly believed they were marching confidently back into the center of their rightful kingdom. They had absolutely no idea that the monumental commencement ceremony they were so desperate to attend was not a stage designed for Piper to finally lift her head and reclaim her lost glory. It was, in reality, a meticulously paved road prepared exclusively for me. They were using their last remaining borrowed dollars to buy front-row seats to watch Reagan Greenwood step out of the shadows and take total, undisputed command of the exact same elite system they had once used to ruthlessly discard her. The universe has a precise, ironic way of balancing the scales. The final reckoning was now only one step away. Exactly 2 weeks prior to the commencement ceremony, I traveled down to the Princeton University campus to conduct a mandatory, comprehensive technical rehearsal. The massive historic auditorium was entirely empty, echoing with the low, steady hum of the industrial air conditioning units and the distant chatter of the audio engineering team. I walked across the vast wooden stage with the exact same clinical, emotionless precision I applied to a corporate audit. I tested the acoustic bounce of the microphone, coordinated the specific sequence of the overhead stage lighting, and memorized the exact physical distance between the backstage holding area and the main oak podium. Everything was executed with absolute, terrifying professionalism. There was no lingering sentimentality in my chest. I was not a wounded girl returning to the scene of a past rejection. I was a highly specialized professional securing the perimeter of her workspace. After I finished the primary sound check, the senior event coordinator, a sharply dressed woman holding a thick leather binder, approached the edge of the stage. She handed me a thick printed document on premium cardstock. It was the finalized seating schematic for the prioritized guest section, located directly in front of the main speaker's podium. Please review the assigned seating arrangements, Miss Greenwood, the coordinator said, her tone unfailingly polite. These are the institutional donors, the university board members, and the internal staff allocations. We just need your final approval. I took the heavy paper and began scanning the meticulously aligned rows of printed names. My eyes tracked down the columns with practiced speed, until I reached the section designated for the third-party logistics vendor. Elmbridge Event Services. Suddenly, my vision locked onto a specific sequence of letters. A cold, sharp electric shock traveled rapidly down my spine, freezing the breath in my lungs for a fraction of a second. Sitting in row 4, occupying seats 12, 13, and 14, were three incredibly familiar names: Grant Greenwood, Elise Greenwood, and Piper Greenwood. They were not listed as the honored family members of the keynote speaker. They had absolutely no idea who was scheduled to stand behind that microphone. They had secured their premium placement entirely through the desperate, backdoor channel of Piper's grueling backstage logistics job. They were walking blindly into the auditorium, completely convinced they were about to witness a standard, boring academic procession. The senior coordinator noticed the slight pause in my breathing. She leaned forward, her expression immediately shifting into a mask of professional concern. "Is there an issue with the schematic, Ms. Greenwood?" she asked softly. "If there is anyone on that list who presents a conflict of interest, a privacy concern, or a personal security issue, you simply need to point them out. We can have their tickets immediately voided and their names permanently removed from the security clearance registry. It only takes one single word from you." I held the immense power of absolute erasure right in the palm of my hand. With one brief sentence, I could have security turn my parents and my sister away at the main iron gates. I could subject them to the ultimate, humiliating public rejection, mirroring exactly what they had done to me 6 years ago when they ordered me to cancel my train ticket. I stared at the three names printed in black ink. Then, I looked up and handed the clipboard directly back to the coordinator. "The seating arrangement is perfectly fine," I replied, my voice completely smooth and undisturbed. "There is absolutely no need to change a single thing." My decision did not stem from some sudden, lingering spark of familial kindness or a sudden desire for reconciliation. It was pure, calculated strategy. Banning them from the campus would have been a loud, messy, and deeply emotional reaction. It would have meant I still cared enough to protect myself from their presence. Allowing them to walk freely into the very center of the trap, entirely unaware that the jaws were about to snap shut around them, was a much colder, vastly superior execution of justice. Leaving the main auditorium, I was escorted through the chaotic, temporary backstage corridors to review the exit protocols. We passed directly through the primary staging area designated for Elmbridge Event Services. The zone was a disaster of frantic logistical preparation. There were massive towers of folded chairs, crushed cardboard boxes overflowing with tangled audio cables, and rolling plastic garbage bins filled with discarded event materials. As I walked past a cluster of damaged, forgotten supplies meant for the incinerator, a specific flash of color caught the corner of my eye. It was a deep, navy blue leather. I stopped walking. I stepped away from the coordinator and reached down into the plastic bin of discarded junk. I pulled out a heavily scuffed, severely bent leather portfolio. The high-quality material was permanently creased, stained with what looked like spilled coffee, and the edges were aggressively frayed. Stamped into the bottom right corner of the cover, barely visible through the grime, were the elegantly embossed gold initials PG. It was the exact same portfolio I had starved myself for 2 weeks to purchase. It was the gift I had mailed with trembling hands the morning after they told me I was too embarrassing to be seen with them. I slowly unzipped the brass fastener. The interior was a chaotic, disrespectful mess. It was stuffed to the breaking point with crumpled takeout receipts, torn post-it notes featuring illegible vendor phone numbers, and stained coffee shop loyalty cards. It had not been used to carry important executive documents or protect valuable career milestones. It had been utilized as a convenient, disposable trash receptacle for everyday junk. I reached my fingers deep into the inner zippered lining of the portfolio. My hand brushed against a small, stiff square of paper. I pulled it out. It was the crisp white card I had included in the package 6 years ago. The ink was slightly faded, but the single sentence I had written was still perfectly legible. "I am so incredibly proud of you. Wishing you a beautiful and perfect day." The card had never been pinned to a corkboard. It had never been tucked into a memory box. It was highly likely it had never even been read twice. It was just forgotten collateral damage. Trapped inside a gift she only kept because the leather was a convenient place to shove her garbage. Standing in that dusty, chaotic supply corridor, staring at the physical manifestation of my discarded love, I waited for the familiar, agonizing ache in my chest. I waited for the sting of tears to blur my vision. Absolutely nothing happened. The discovery did not hurt me. Instead, it acted as a final, absolute chemical neutralizing agent. It instantly dissolved any microscopic lingering trace of softness or hesitation that might have been hiding in the deepest recesses of my mind. The crumpled receipts and the forgotten card confirmed the ultimate, inescapable truth in their eyes. My grueling labor, my financial sacrifice, and my genuine affection were never viewed as acts of love. My efforts were only ever viewed as cheap background materials, useful only until they found something shinier to replace them with. I dropped the leather portfolio right back into the garbage bin where it belonged and walked away without looking back. The night before the monumental ceremony, I sat alone in my quiet, heavily secured hotel room. The only source of light was the harsh, blue glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. I opened the digital document containing my finalized keynote speech. I did not rewrite the speech to turn it into an aggressive, screaming manifesto of personal revenge. Shouting is for people who are desperately trying to convince the world that they are right. I did not need to convince anyone. I spent 2 hours meticulously editing the text, carefully stripping away any flowery adjectives or emotional padding. I added a few incredibly sharp, precise sentences. I sharpened the narrative until it cut like a surgical scalpel. I wanted to deliver something vastly more terrifying than a dramatic family confrontation. I wanted to deliver an undeniable, mathematically flawless truth. And I was going to deliver that truth with perfect posture and a calm voice, standing directly in front of the exact same elite auditorium that my parents had always considered the supreme, ultimate court of human value. There is one rule in every true reckoning: you do not interrupt people while they are walking willingly toward the truth. By morning, the Greenwood family was going to get the flawless, unforgettable picture they had always wanted. The morning of the commencement ceremony broke over the Princeton campus in a wash of brilliant early summer sunlight. The sprawling, perfectly manicured lawns were completely flooded with beautifully dressed families, all radiating the exact kind of polished, generational confidence my parents had always worshipped. I stood quietly in the cool shadows of the backstage holding area. I was wearing a minimalist, impeccably tailored dark suit. I did not feel nervous. My posture was entirely calm, possessing the quiet stillness of a person who had methodically rebuilt herself from absolute ash. Out in the massive audience, my parents were settling into the premium folding chairs secured by the guest passes Piper had provided. My sister was pacing the outer aisles nearby, wearing her black polo shirt, a heavy Elmbridge Event Services staff lanyard, and a crackling earpiece. She was scrolling through her phone, looking profoundly bored and irritated, completely oblivious to the massive seismic event about to detonate directly under her feet. The university president stepped up to the main podium. The massive crowd hushed. He spoke about integrity, about hard truths, and about the necessity of moral clarity in the modern financial sector. Then, his voice echoed through the towering speakers across the lawn. It is my profound honor to introduce this year's keynote speaker. She is the brilliant forensic financial expert who recently exposed the catastrophic corruption within the Summit Scholars Trust. Please welcome Reagan Greenwood. From my vantage point just behind the heavy velvet curtain, I watched the exact moment the words registered in row 4. The physical reaction was instantaneous. My father's confident smile completely vanished. My mother froze, her manicured hand hovering uselessly over her designer purse. Piper, standing near the center aisle, physically stumbled, dropping her phone onto the grass. They realized, far too late, that they had spent their very last borrowed dollars to march blindly into the absolute center of my truth. I walked out onto the sunlit stage. I adjusted the microphone. I looked out over the sea of thousands of faces, my eyes briefly sweeping over row 4. I did not begin my address with fiery anger. I began with a quiet, undeniable story. 6 years ago, a young woman was explicitly told not to show up on this very campus for a family milestone, I said, my voice projecting smoothly across the silent green. She was told to cancel her train ticket because she was not polished enough. She wore discount clothes. She worked brutal night shifts to afford her public university tuition, and she was told her very presence would embarrass her family. They needed a perfect picture, and she was merely a smudge on the lens. The silence in the audience was absolute. It was heavy and breathless. But there is a profound, beautiful irony in being pushed entirely to the margins. I continued, my gaze steady. The people who are banished to the dark learn how to build real, unshakable value, rather than simply acting out the theatrical role of value. There's a massive difference between rented prestige and forged dignity. Educational institutions, corporate boards, and families are only truly worthy of respect when they open their doors to genuine capability and character. Not just to those who are exceptionally good at taking photographs next to ancient, ivy-covered gates. The crowd remained completely spellbound. I laid bare the absolute emptiness of prioritizing the aesthetic of success over the substance of hard work. When I finished my final sentence, the silence held for 2 long seconds before the entire lawn erupted. It was not polite applause. Thousands of people rose to their feet, delivering a deafening, explosive standing ovation. Before I left the podium, I raised my hand to quiet the crowd for one final announcement. Today, I am officially launching the Open Ledger Fellowship, I stated clearly. This is a fully funded endowment specifically designed for low-income students who desperately need financial capital to pay for their professional certification exams, their graduate applications, and their advanced study materials. The exact barriers that were meant to bury us will now become the doors we open for others. The ceremony concluded in a chaotic, joyful rush of flying caps and cheering graduates. I stepped down from the main stage and walked toward the designated reception area, flanked by Vera Kincaid and several of my senior colleagues from North Ledger Restructuring. Before we could even reach the catering tents, my mother launched herself through the crowd. She was practically sprinting, her face plastered with a frantic, wide smile, her arms outstretched for a highly visible, maternal embrace. My father was right behind her, trailing slightly, and Piper was dragging her feet, her face pale and terrified. "Reagan! Oh my goodness! Reagan!" my mother cried out, loud enough for the wealthy families nearby to hear. She was instantly attempting to rewrite our entire history on the spot. "We are so incredibly proud of you. We always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. Get together. Let us take a picture," my father chimed in, adopting a soft, deeply manipulative tone. "It has been far too long, sweetheart. We have had our little communication misunderstandings in the past. But today is about family." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch away. I simply reached into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out the heavily creased, navy blue leather portfolio I had salvaged from the backstage garbage bin the day before. I held it up. I unzipped it, revealing the crumpled takeout receipts and the stained coffee cards inside. Then, I pulled out the crisp white card I had written 6 years ago. I looked directly at my sister. "Piper," I said, my voice completely flat, "do you remember this gift, the one you used as a trash can and threw into a lost and found bin behind the catering tent?" Piper stared at the embossed letters. Her breath hitched in her throat. The question struck them with the force of a physical blow. It completely dismantled their fragile narrative. They could not claim they had simply made a parenting mistake or experienced a communication error. The discarded portfolio was undeniable. Physical proof that they had actively, repeatedly, and maliciously treated me like garbage because they firmly believed they would never need me. Piper completely broke down. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for years instantly collapsed. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup. "I am sorry," Piper sobbed, her voice trembling with absolute panic. I was always so terribly jealous of you. You had the one single thing our parents could never buy for me. You had real ability. I have nothing. I am just pretending. Instead of comforting her weeping daughter, my mother reacted with pure, unfiltered venom. She spun around, her face twisting in fury, and grabbed Piper by the arm. Stop crying right now, my mother hissed aggressively. Do not embarrass this family in front of these people. That single, reflexive command exposed the absolute, horrifying truth. After losing everything, after being publicly humiliated, the only thing that woman still worshipped was the hollow, empty shell of outward appearances. I looked at the three of them standing on the grass. They looked small, broken, and entirely exhausted by their own lies. I forgave you all a very long time ago, I said, drawing the final, permanent boundary. I had to forgive you so I could survive and move forward. But you need to understand that my forgiveness does not mean the door is open. We are completely done. I turned my back on them. I walked away, joining Vera Kincaid and the colleagues who had taught me, pushed me, and truly supported me. They were my real family. I left my parents and my sisters standing frozen in the middle of the sunlit Princeton lawn. For the very first time in their miserable, curated lives, they were finally forced to understand that the embarrassing element in the Greenwood family was never Reagan. The truly shameful thing was exactly how they had treated her. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below and let us share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people around the world.